Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Our next session, The Collapse of the Reich, features an author and historian we have long had in our sights, but just have not happened to connect and to get him here until now. Prit Buttar is a retired doctor who served in the British Army as a surgeon. As a historian, he has written countless books, many of which you'll be able to purchase after this session and have him sign. He has a fascinating story about how he came from the medical world into the historical world, and you can read about that in the biography, but also in one of his great books. But I also wanted to point out that he has been joined by his daughter, Lottie, who's been a marvelous guest with us this weekend. So thank you for being here, Lottie. And thank you, Prit, for being here. Interviewing Prit will be Dr. Alexandra Richie. Alex is very well known to everybody here as a frequent, constant presenter at our international conferences. But many of you, show of hands, who has traveled somewhere outside of the United States with Alex Richie? Sort of what I thought. Not enough. I actually thought more. When we let her, she's teaching her students at university in Poland, and she is the noted author of two wonderful books, sort of biographies of cities, Faust Metropolis on Berlin and Warsaw 1944, about the Warsaw Uprising. Ladies and gentlemen, Prit Buttar and Alexandra Richie.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, and welcome, Prit. It's such an honor to have you here and to talk about this subject. We made it. It's the end of the conference. We've done it. No disasters. It's always a bittersweet moment because the conference is so wonderful, and we've sort of rounded the globe and back to talk about World War II subjects and history, and all of the presentations are wonderful. We're talking about something that hasn't been touched on yet so much, which is the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front from our perspective, so that's a kind of a shorthand. The Soviets obviously didn't talk about it. And the Eastern Front is just hugely important as well because, as we have been talking for the last couple of days, that this was a global war. I mean, it touched the whole Earth. Everybody who lived on the planet at the time was in one way or another touched by the war. And of course, the history of what happened on the Eastern Front is no exception. And in fact, because it was such a huge field of battle, really, there's nothing in the war that can be understood or explained without understanding something about that. Even things like the Normandy invasions, when you think that 75–80% Wehrmacht casualties are on the Eastern Front, the SS, all of the things that are going on, tying up German soldiers. If all of those troops had been waiting for us at Normandy, we wouldn't have managed to do it. And so there's a symbiotic relationship between all of the things that are happening, including there. And so sometimes when people ask me, well, what's the relationship between the Eastern Front and the American experience of World War II? Because after all, that's what this museum's DNA effectively is. But there are many, many, many points of contact and points of interest. I know lots of you have traveled with me before, and you've seen some of these things. So, for example, Jason was talking a little bit earlier about prisoners of war. We go to Stalag Luft 3, and we go to Auflag 64, the largest American POW camp for American officers, for example. And they also endured a death march at the end of in January 45. We talk about Lend-Lease, for example. Of course, the British got the lion's share of Lend-Lease, but there were three avenues of Lend-Lease going into the Soviet Union from the north, from Iran, across from Vladivostok over the Trans-Siberian Railway. Hugely important. Operation Frantic, the three air bases that were set up in Vinica and elsewhere behind Soviet lines, which, interestingly enough, became a kind of a bellwether for the coming Cold War. Stalin began to treat these Americans worse and worse over this time. And, of course, the Holocaust, which touched many, many Americans through their family stories and so on, and also refugees, for example, German refugees who managed to get away from the Red Army, crossed maybe the Frischeshof, got to the United States, and their families live here. and also the harbingers of the Cold War and all of these other things. So the Eastern Front is enormously important for all sorts of reasons, but also, of course, because of the huge conflict that it was. And so my first question to you, Prit, is really, before we do a deep dive into, because the theme is really the end of the Reich, so Bagration, the fighting going on into Berlin. But even before that happens with Barbarossa, I mean, this is a massive, massive fight from the very beginning. So maybe you could just start off with giving us a picture of what the Eastern Front means and how big it was.
Absolutely. In many respects, you can think of the Eastern Front as the reason why Hitler goes to war in the first place. In Mein Kampf, he spells it all out, that Germany's destiny is to have a land-based empire, and the only place that's going to come from are the European territories of the Soviet Union, and he intends to carve that out. Everything is, he even says at one point when the British and French are threatening hostilities, if he enters Poland, he tells his generals, the Western powers just don't understand. Everything I do is directed against the Bolsheviks. If necessary, I'll have to fight them and defeat the Western powers first before I can turn against the East, but that is the ultimate objective. So from the German perspective, this was always the priority. By the time you get to November 43, things are obviously changing rather dramatically. The war in the East has proved somewhat harder to win than was originally anticipated. And in November 43, Hitler issues Führer Directive 51, which is his strategic directive for how the war is to be fought to a successful conclusion. And he outlines that fighting a two-front war is obviously a disastrous position for Germany, and the way to avoid this is to release the absolute maximum number of forces available to hold in preparation for the landings expected in the West for 1944. The top priority is to crush the Anglo-French, Canadian, American forces as they come ashore, whilst holding the Red Army at bay with the minimum necessary force. The fact that that minimum necessary force accounts for 70% of the Wehrmacht gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. Now, we can say this is a pretty rubbish war-winning strategy, but by then, Germany really doesn't have any good cards left to play. Yeah. But it gives you an idea of, even when it was being given secondary importance, the Eastern Front was all-consuming for Germany.
Well, and the other thing about it to remember is that when you talk about the war in the West or taking over Norway or the Low Countries, I mean, unpleasant things happen, but the war in the East from the very beginning was to be a war of annihilation. You know, Hunger Plan, the Generalplan Ost, the AB-Aktion in Poland, the Einsatzgruppen, the Holocaust. I mean, all of these terrible things that happen, which, of course, the brutality feeds on itself, and you know, by the end of the war, I mean, people if you've got a Red Cross sign on your roof of your van, you're almost certainly going to be killed. You know, the brutality is horrific. Can you talk about that?
Waitman Bjorn, who's an American who teaches Holocaust studies in the north of England, has put this very, very neatly, and he says that the Holocaust in the European Soviet Union didn't take place because the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. The cause and effect is the other way around. They invaded the Soviet Union in order to carry out mass murder. From the very outset, Barbarossa is a genocidal project, which is why the whole mythology around the clean Wehrmacht is so hollow. By carrying out this operation, they were explicitly creating the conditions for the mass killing that followed.
Yeah, and we, of course, we think first and foremost of the Shoah, of the Holocaust,
yes.
but the mass murder, effectively, of Soviet prisoners of war, which runs into the millions of so many other people, all as part and parcel of that. Yes. But this brings us to the numbers. I mean, again, starting even with Barbarossa, can you give us a sense of the scale of this war?
To give you an idea of just in terms of human casualties, military and civilian losses in the Soviet Union exceed 20 million people during the Second World War. There are countries in Europe with populations far smaller than that. the booksellers here are selling my 2 volumes on Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad lasted famously 900 days. More Soviet citizens died in and around Leningrad during those 900 days than British Empire war dead from both world wars put together. And this is just one city. The scale of death, the scale of the armies that were mobilized and fought over this terrain is something that is, quite difficult sometimes for the mind to grasp. And one thing I often encourage people who read my books is when you come across a map of, for example, the Leningrad area or the advance on Moscow, go to Google Maps and zoom into that area, and then without changing the scale, scroll over to a more familiar part of the world's geography, just to get a feel for the size. So one of the operations we're going to talk about today, which coincides with the Battle of Normandy, was when the Red Army attacked the central forces of the Germans on the Eastern Front, Bagration, which is my next book out in March. You can start saving now if you... Thank you. The starting line for Bagration would be the equivalent of a start line running from New York City to Richmond, Virginia. And that is just part of the Eastern Front. You have 4 army groups there. North of that, you have a further 4 army groups that carry on the front line all the way to the Arctic Circle, and another 4 army groups south of it, extending the front line to the Black Sea. The advance would be the equivalent of our start line from New York City. To get to Berlin, they have to go from there all the way to Minneapolis. And they're going to do that in 10 months in 3 major operations. And as the Germans are pulling out through that territory, they're destroying every bridge, every railway line, flooding areas, and the Red Army has to maintain a tempo of operations through that area at tremendous cost of life, as Rob Citino mentioned at the outset. The scale of this is something that really takes your breath away. And if you think about the intensity of the fighting in Normandy, as you said, and as Rob said on the first day, the heavy losses suffered in clearing the Schwarzwald and the Rhineland, that's against 30% of the Wehrmacht. And even a modest release of resources from the east would have made it almost impossible for the Anglo-American forces to reach the Rhine.
And it brings up this whole question about the perceptions of this war as well, which, of course, as you write about, the Soviets after the war were quite keen on the propaganda to try and make us believe certain things that happened that hadn't, and so on. But nevertheless, of course, the idea and Goebbelsian propaganda was very much, the Wehrmacht, the Germans are going in, they're all motorized, and, let's ignore all the horses in the background because we're going to just show pictures of the tanks and everything else. But nevertheless, the Germans did have this, of course, their concept of war, which is to go in hard and have a quick defeat. The boys will be home by Christmas, and it's all going to be perfect. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, that didn't quite go to plan. They did very well at the beginning, but it wasn't quite enough. And of course, the Soviets are, thanks to Stalin's purges, thanks to not being prepared, thanks to his own paranoia, not believing in the invasion, and then the disasters that happen right away. We get that sense of the Soviets at the beginning being in a terrible rout and a disastrous situation, and then as the war goes on, it changes. But the question, I suppose, to you is maybe talk about that a little bit, and these different armies, how they fought, and so on. But also, how much of the Soviet successes in something like Bagration and going on into Berlin were because the Germans had run out of fuel and run out of men and run out of everything practically. And the Red Army was maybe not improving as much as we think, or we were told they have, but they were also up against forces that were far inferior to what they'd been in 1941. Yes. So talk a little bit about those changes.
Yes. Both of those points are absolutely right. You can think of this as 2 lines crossing on a graph. So in summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht is in many respects at the peak of its power. very experienced soldiers. They've fought in France and Poland. They know what they're doing. They've trained alongside each other. They've fought alongside each other. They've ironed out any wrinkles as best they can, and they're really geared up for this, whereas the Red Army goes into this war with completely the wrong doctrine, largely the wrong equipment at that stage, an officer corps that was massively torn apart by Stalin's purges, the consequence of which is they are terrified, they will show no initiative, much better to follow an order slavishly, and if that order says you've got to attack over there and the attack fails, you just throw more men at it, because to show any initiative invites an unpleasant conversation with the NKVD, which is not going to end well.
Yeah.
And even after the invasion starts, Soviet generals are being taken away and shot for failing to stop it. Stalin very rapidly realizes that this is not the way to fight a war. So he starts to trust what is at first a relatively small body of senior officers, and then increasingly the officers that they designate as being, good commanders. So he starts relaxing the tight control that he attempts to impose at the start of the war. And almost in parallel, Hitler is gradually increasing his micromanagement. And even by the first winter of the war, at one point he's on the phone to a division commander outside Moscow, and he's telling this guy, I can see that you've got a battalion deployed in a cemetery in this village. How many machine guns do you have covering that cemetery? This is at the head of state dictating to the deployment of support weapons in one battalion on this vast front line. And it gets worse. By the time we get to the summer of 44, you can't move any armored forces without the explicit permission of the Führer. If he's asleep, that means it's going to have to wait till he wakes up. No territory it can be given up without permission. Meanwhile, Stalin is increasingly relaxed and saying, okay, I now have a team that can win. But I think it's worth saying something that I mentioned in a couple of my books, that in many respects, the Red Army is a blunt instrument. You find yourself in a fight against a guy with a very effective sharp sword, and you're armed with a cudgel. Now, as the war goes on, the Red Army gets better at swinging that cudgel. And in some respects, the cudgel becomes a slightly better cudgel, but it's no sword. Yeah. And the thing is that they do this whilst very literally fighting for their existence. And although we can criticize their development and in many respects, even at the end of the war, despite their great victories, they are not really anywhere near the professional standards of Western armies. For them to have come as far as they did in an existential war is actually an astonishing achievement.
Yeah, but it's also, of course, to do with resources as well. I mean, natural resources and men, material, lend-lease, all of these things come into play as well. And of course, that Germany is a relatively small power by comparison, and it's just running out of everything. But I think that's interesting to talk about the comparison between Hitler's leadership style, if you will, and Stalin's, and to also remember when we're talking about the Eastern Front that we're dealing with two absolute dictatorships. I mean, two of the most horrific human beings ever to have walked the planet.
Yes.
Both of them in pretty well complete control of their respective militaries or whatever. And as you say, Stalin is intelligent enough to give way a little bit, to understand that someone like Zhukov or Rokossovsky might actually be able to do the job. But it's interesting looking at Stalin's management style in the sense that he actually isn't a particularly great military brain. But he's very good at things like understanding what factory production and so on. I mean, he's quite an interesting guy. He's not the sort of monolithic character that we tend to see.
Exactly. He also, I think his strength lies particularly in an area which is almost devoid of strength on the German side, which is he has a very good eye for the highest level. So he has a good idea for setting strategic objectives, and then absolutely stealing from the German playbook. So the strategic objective is to do this, and then all of the operational directives have to be subordinate to that to deliver that. Whereas on the German side, even their so-called best strategists, people like Manstein, etc., actually they're good operational commanders. But because strategy has been left to the Führer, who's Military training consists of being a corporal in the First World War. It's not a good basis for strategic decision-making.
Well, except, I mean, he is interesting in the sense that, and there are all of these debates. Of course, the generals all wrote their memoirs after the war to say it's all Hitler's fault and they were all brilliant and perfect. But also, I mean, for example, understanding the importance of oil fields in Romania and so on, that some of his generals weren't so...
Well, that's an interesting thing because, you know, Hitler said on more than one occasion, my generals don't understand economics. And, you know, I can't retreat out of Ukraine because we need the molybdenum mines at Nikopol, and without that we can't make decent quality steel and the manganese from those mines. At one point, Albert Speer, who's been mentioned in this conference before, the armaments minister, goes to Hitler and says, I've spoken to the industrialists. They say they can make steel that is 98% as good without using any manganese, so we don't need those mines. Hitler is furious, and he rages at Speer, saying, I finally had a reason to force the generals to stop retreating, and you're now telling them that it's not valid. How dare you do this? So Hitler was very happy to use rather spurious economic arguments, but at least he was considering the economic and resource implications, whereas his generals were not. And something that's often overlooked is that amidst all of this mythology of this ultra-professional, ultra-efficient German war machine, their approach to logistics is something that for the English-speaking armies would have been incomprehensible. It was explicit in German military training that logistic limitations should not limit the scope of operational planning. Now just stop and think about that. So, you know, in what planet does that make sense, particularly in an era of mechanized warfare? If you do not have the fuel and ammunition and the food and the warm weather clothing, etc., it doesn't matter how tactically good you are.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we come to something like Bagration, for example, if you actually look at the incredible Soviet planning and the successes and just the logistics again. I mean, you know, Hitler was busy tinkering around micromanaging and trying to improve one version of a tank over another version. And the Soviets are just churning out the T-34 and maybe making a few changes with the hatches or sticking some handles on them or some better armor or whatever else. But they know that there's no point in having this perfect machine going out in the mud of the steppes in Ukraine or Belarus because it'll last for 2 days and you got to haul it back and fix it.
Well, the T-34 ends the war with the very dubious distinction of being the most destroyed tank in history.
True. But for good reason, there were an awful lot of them.
Which is largely a reflection of the sheer number that were produced.
Yeah.
And another interesting thing is, although we talk about, you know, the Tiger tank and then the King Tiger or the Royal Tiger, the original Tiger tank, there were about 1,700 made. Only 11 or 12 at any time were identical. There were constant little adjustments. It might be as little as a different model radio or something. It may be as different as a 3-bolt flange on the exhaust instead of a 4-bolt flange. So just imagine the logistic nightmare for the engineers and the maintenance crews, etc. So yes, this pursuit of technical excellence resulted in this incremental evolution. So effectively, you end up with dozens of different models. Yes. And when they invaded the Soviet Union, the Germans had commandeered trucks from all over Europe. So you have these armies entering the Soviet Union, followed by these columns of civilian trucks. Firstly, they're not built for the roads of the Soviet Union, and they literally disintegrate. But secondly, look at this again from the logistic point of view. Imagine having to provide replacement tires for every type of truck currently operating in Western Europe. And this is what the Wehrmacht has to do.
So tell me little bit about, or tell us a little bit about Bagration now. This is sort of what is it and why is it so important? Because most people who aren't specialists in the war, Eastern Front, have heard of Stalingrad, they've heard of Kursk or whatever else.
Yes.
Maybe not so much Bagration, but arguably is the most important battle that Stalin wins, the complete destruction of Army Group Center, effectively.
Yes. Stalin had promised Churchill and Roosevelt that the Red Army would launch a major operation, ideally to coincide with the invasion of Europe, but even if it didn't kick off at exactly the same time, it would follow in short order in order to help with the land warfare that was going to follow the landings. For various reasons, it ends up starting in the third week of June in 1944, by which time the Allied forces are already ashore in Normandy. The Soviets have been preparing for this since the spring. They have been building up stockpiles. Slight digression here. This comes against a background of enormous frustration and suspicion in Moscow about when are the Western powers finally going to get around to launching a second front? You know, we're doing all the fighting, we are dying in huge numbers, when are you guys going to start helping out? In fact, Stalin has been calling on his allies since late 1941, you know, can't you just get on with it now? And at one point, Churchill says to him, there's no point in me starting an operation which costs us 125,000 lives for no gain. To which Stalin's reply is, have you any idea how much every single one of our operations costs? And at the Tehran conference, his old Civil War crony, Clement Voroshilov, shocks the British and American officers by complaining bitterly of, I don't understand what the fuss is, crossing the English Channel. You know, my armies cross rivers all the time. This is just like a big river crossing, right? You know, and you know, from the Soviet point of view, they're very suspicious that actually the Brits and the Americans are sitting on their hands because they quite like the sight of Germany and the Soviet Union bleeding each other to death. Yeah. But eventually we get to summer 44. The Western powers are ashore in Normandy, and these four. The Soviet terminology is they're called fronts. We would think of them as army groups. There are four of these. The Germans are occupying, this is roughly the eastern part of Belarus on a modern map. So the Germans are occupying what is effectively a large bulge towards the east. And on top of that bulge, around the city of Vitebsk, there is a smaller salient, which is absolute madness. When you look at the maps, this is absolutely inviting the Red Army to bite off this salient. And any, you know, you can imagine any West Point cadet being, you know, shown this would think, you really want me to hold this? This is crazy. And yet that was what Hitler was saying. Yeah. And this is one of his designated fortresses. You can only give this up with explicit consent of the Führer. So the Red Army launches the operation in a series of phases. It takes about 3 days for all of these fronts to kick off. And this is something they had learned during the First World War, where because of logistic limitations, their great offensive of 1916, the Brusilov offensive, unfolded over several days. And what they realized was that at that time, the German and Austro-Hungarian forces, and then later in the Second World War, the German forces, they had this German doctrine of early counterattack. You know, one of my friends who I do battlefield tours with says, you know, there are 3 inevitabilities in life, you know, death, taxation, and German counterattacks. This is what the Germans do. And they discovered at the Brusilov offensive that if they launched their offensive with a staggered start, any German reserves would get sucked into the first bit, and then they're not available for the other bits of the operation that unfold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the strange thing about this is exactly as you said, in the 2 lines on the graph of the Soviets improving and Hitler just going, it seems more and more crazy, because he comes up with this idea of fortress cities. And Stalin expects to get a few hundred miles in the whole operation, and he gets that in literally a few weeks. And all of these very important cities fall. You mentioned Vitebsk and Orsha and Minsk, which is a hugely important city.
Yes.
And there's all those testimonies of people who are trying desperately to get out, you know, papers being burned and people trying to get out on the last troop transports and whatever else, because, you know, they don't expect this to happen so quickly. And yet Hitler persists with this ridiculous fortress idea, which goes all the way to the siege of Breslau, I mean, which carries on even after Hitler's death. It seems insane. So what on earth provoked this madness?
Speer, I think, in his frankly rather self-serving memoirs, does nonetheless have, they're a cracking read. He's a good writer, but it's a little bit like Chuikov's memoirs. Fantastic writer, but some of this is fiction, But Speer, I think, does sum it up quite nicely, that an awful lot of Hitler's military thinking goes back to his own experience of the Flanders battlefields. So his own personal experience of combat is trench warfare on the Western Front where the front lines don't move. So he still believes that even in the days of armored warfare, etc., if you build a strong enough defensive line, it can be held against pretty much anything. I mean, the use of fortresses in warfare, the last time fortresses held out in any meaningful manner would have been during the Napoleonic Wars. Yeah. And even then, as Napoleon retreated and he left his armies holding places like Davout holding out in Danzig, even after the emperor has abdicated, they didn't do anything. They just sat there in the city. They weren't of any military value. But Hitler believes that you can have a fortress. If the Red Army advances past it, it allows itself to be enveloped. It holds the city. It ties down enemy forces. It stops them running supplies along railway lines, etc. And then we will launch a relief effort and break through to it. And we may just evacuate the garrison. We may restore the front line. First of all, this requires enough reserves to make a relief effort. Secondly, although army commanders were told Vitebsk is a fortress and you have to provide a garrison, they were given no additional resources. Yeah. So the best that they could do was say, well, okay, so these divisions to the east, as they retreat, they will become the garrison. But the trouble was it was never enough. So in the case of Vitebsk, it was meant they had calculated it would take 4 full-strength divisions to hold the city. In the event, there was probably the equivalent of slightly under 2 divisions available, and the same for the other fortresses further west. When you get to Vilnius, Vilnius is a crazy place to be a fortress. If you go up to the castle in Vilnius, you can see it sits in a bowl of hills. Yes. It's a crazy place to have a fortress. Enemy artillery can just shell you wherever you like. And again, they never had enough troops. It was a bad strategy implemented even more badly. So it was always going to fail.
So the thing is that again, that reputation of the Eastern Front being so brutal and vicious. I mean, you've mentioned the scorched earth policy, where not only have many millions of civilians been murdered, villages burned, cities and towns destroyed, but then when the Red Army comes back the other way, they sort of start doing the same thing. So when you talk about the mopping up of those so-called fortresses, you get those terrible testimonies of the Soviets going in and killing everybody in the hospital beds and so on.
Yes.
I mean, the level of violence, I guess that's the other point about the Eastern Front, the scale of violence there is just off the charts, and it's very difficult for us to understand it. And occasionally little mementos of that kind of violence make their way to the Western Front. We're all horrified by the 1 or 2 massacres that take place, but it's just par for the course on the Eastern Front.
Absolutely that. And as Rob Citino said a couple of days back, his quote from Clausewitz, that as a war continues, more and more extreme measures become possible. And to a degree, this is people just becoming acclimatized to violence. Yes. The longer a war drags on, the longer violence drags on, the greater your own personal exposure to it, the more tolerant you become of violence, the more you come to regard the other side as different. And as soon as you start othering people like that, you can justify pretty much anything. And when you have a war on the Eastern Front, where from the very outset, this has been a war against the Untermensch, yes. You're starting from your baseline is already one where you're treating the other side as not quite human. You also, the other aspect of this baseline that's worth considering is that there was the slightly flippant line yesterday that after the Tokyo firebombing, US public opinion appeared to be more interested in when horse racing was going to be permitted than the fact that tens of thousands of Japanese people had burned to death. But, by comparison to what's going on in the East, it's a very different thing. And in the East, you have German society, which had a decade of political violence before the Nazis came to power. It then has several years of Nazi rule with open violence against Jews, communists, etc. In the Soviet Union, you start with a history of pretty casual violence in Imperial Russia. You then have the revolution, the absolutely brutal civil war. So you have two societies which, compared to the United States or Britain or the Western countries, these are states that start with a much higher level of exposure and tolerance of extreme violence. And then on top of that, you inflict this extremely bloody and violent war. So yeah, you're right. And it's no coincidence that the Malmedy massacre is carried out by an SS division that has been really doing exactly that on the Eastern Front from the moment it arrived there. And for them, this is just how you fight war.
Yeah. And we see this with the end of Bagration is really stops at the Vistula River effectively. I mean, with the Warsaw Uprising and so on, and you see precisely that these people, these killers like Erich von den Bach-Zaleski and Oskar Dörlewanger, who've spent really they have perfected the art of massacring and killing and raping civilians, are then moved to crush the Warsaw Uprising, and the violence against civilians is unspeakably horrific, and yet. Exactly. These people, for them, this
is just how you do it.
How you do it.
This is how you do it. There is an absolutely horrific document, a book of documents. It's about this thick, and these are the reports written by the Einsatzgruppen in the Soviet Union just up to winter 1941, where Himmler was encouraging them to write reports so they could share best practice on how to kill people. So it's in these that Friedrich Jeckeln first describes what he calls Sardinenpackung, which is sardine packing. So you shoot a load of Jews, they lie in a layer, you put another layer of Jews on them and shoot them, and it's a very efficient way of dealing with the corpses. This very cold language, and absolutely open about what they're doing. Yeah. And that's in 41. So by the time you get to 44, you have 3 years of brutality that has built upon that start line.
And then it ties, of course, into the question of what the German population know about or thinking about this. And you mentioned the massacre at Nemmersdorf, for example, which is the first time that the Soviets actually get into formerly German territory, and there's a massacre of civilians there and some prisoners of war, incidentally. And then the Germans retake the village, and the Goebbelsian propaganda goes racing up to make films and to show the German people how terrible it's going to be when the Red Army comes in, which leads me to the other question, which is why did the Germans fight on? And this is one of the reasons. They also knew the crimes they'd committed. The people, anybody who'd been on the Eastern Front knew people were being massacred, whatever. But there was also the propaganda element as well.
Absolutely, and it all becomes very interlocking. And I think the starting point is I would encourage anybody to try to imagine what it was like to be a citizen of Nazi Germany. There is no internet. You have had strict government control of the media. Listening to foreign radio stations is punishable by immediate arrest or worse. If you're a 25-year-old defending Berlin in 1945, you were 13 when Hitler came to power. Your access to media has been so tightly constrained, you've completely bought into this notion of we talk about the British and the American sense of entitlement and privilege. In Nazi Germany, this is massive. We are the Herrenvolk. We are the master race. We have an entitlement to a land empire. We were robbed at the end of the First World War with the stab in the back legend. We were never defeated. It was those terrible politicians who betrayed us. So they've bought into all of this, and of course they've ridden the dizzy roller coaster of the early years of Hitler's successes And even in 45, there are plenty of accounts from people cowering in cellars in Berlin from the Allied bombing and then later the Soviet shelling. And there are still individuals there saying, don't worry, the Fuhrer will save us. He's got something in mind. And even at that point, the most that anyone else will do is just keep silent.
Exactly.
And as for knowledge of the crimes, so many Germans would then later deny they knew anything, even those in the military. Some of that was just patently ridiculous. Certainly any officer must have known what was happening on the Eastern Front. And even the ordinary civilian population, I am increasingly left with the feeling that they knew or suspected a great deal more than they ever let on. People were coming back on leave for short periods from the Eastern Front. Inevitably, some of those tens of thousands of soldiers would have broken down in tears at home and said, you have no idea what we're doing, and someone would have put a hand around their shoulders and said, tell me. So word would have got out, and they knew that they faced a horrendous collective punishment. And then, of course, after the example of Nemmersdorf at the end of 1944, they have seen that in practice. Yes. And the attempts by Goebbels to portray to the world the bestial behavior of the Red Army kind of fall on deaf ears, because this is shortly after the Red Army has overrun the first of the concentration camps, and those are the images that are circulating in the world. No one's interested in about 72 German civilians being raped and massacred.
Yeah. And then I see we're just about to run out of time and go to questions, but so that really brings us to the end of Bagration, then to the preparations for the final attack on Berlin. And once again, there's this feeling, why did the Germans fight? I think you mentioned a number of these reasons, but one of the reasons that the fighting is so vicious in the East is partly because they knew what they'd done, but also because there was a sense of, well, if we can at least keep fighting on the Eastern Front, we can, hopefully the Americans and the Brits will come in.
So at very senior levels, there is an awareness of the intention of the Allies to partition Germany. But even with the knowledge of that, people like Heinrici, who commands Army Group Vistula defending Berlin, even when he is told by Jodl, you do realize this is all going to be handed over to the Soviets, he still says, I've got to fight as long as I can in the hope that the Americans change their mind.
Yeah, and maybe something will happen.
Yeah.
And then, of course, when Roosevelt dies, Hitler thinks the whole thing is great.
Yeah, this is great. The tide has turned.
Goebbels comes in with the runes and says, oh, yes, there's going to be a magnificent change. And, of course, it's all absolute nonsense. And then, of course, another aspect which is sometimes brought up is this question of unconditional surrender, and then Hitler's wonder weapons. And then there's so many of these layers of reasons that...
There are, and the other thing that I've found, which I personally found quite hard to understand until I then started reflecting on recent politics in Britain and I dare say in the United States, the ability of people to hold completely contradictory points of view at the same time with great ease. So on the one hand, you can look around and you can see Berlin is in ruins and the city is being bombed flat, and you haven't heard from your son in the army for months, and your neighbor's 2 sons have been reported as dead. You can see for yourself how terrible it is. And yet the Fuhrer says we're still going to win. And people can hold these contradictory views. There were even many in Germany who, even knowing that the end was coming, they were so terrified of another stab-in-the-back legend. They said, well, if the end is going to come, it is better that it comes as such a catastrophic defeat that there is nowhere to hide.
Yeah, well, that was rather Hitler's idea. I mean, he had a sort of strange neo-Darwinist racial reason for it, but, we didn't deserve to win against the Russians, so let's just destroy everything, his Nero order and all of these other things as well. It's just destroy everything because we didn't win, so we might as well not be on the planet. Horrific.
And again, the wave of suicides that follows his death, and people have, I think in some cases, trivialized is that there were multiple motives. Some of these people knew they were going to be punished. A lot of the generals who shot themselves, they knew they were guilty of war crimes. But in the case of many of the civilians and also many of the military, these were people who had already experienced the bitterness of defeat in 1918, and they literally could not face that emotional catastrophe again. Yeah. And for them, death was better than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeremy, I think we've run out of we've run out of time, according to the clock up here. So thank you so much, Prit. Brilliant. We'd go on for hours. It's fabulous.
We could.
Please raise your hand if you have any questions. First question is going to be up in the front to your left.
Great conversation, both of you. Thank you. Prit, could you talk a little bit about the shift in Soviet battle doctrine and what precipitated that shift? You had mentioned it in the very beginning of your talk.
The evolution of the Red Army just never stops. They start the war with their force balance is all wrong. The tank units are very unwieldy. The infantry units are just too big for practical command. They have a mixture of tanks in the same unit, and Rotmistrov at one point complains, this is stupid. You have the light tanks gallop ahead, they get shot up because they're too light. Then the medium tanks arrive, they get shot up because the Germans know they're coming, and then the heavy tanks arrive and destroy all the bridges and no one can move. And so all the way through the war, they're tinkering with the way that their forces work. One of the interesting things is that compared to other armies, and indeed even the Western armies, the Red Army is very good at the end of each operation of holding, if you like, a detailed debrief and an analysis of, so what went well, what went badly. And inevitably, the same things come up. Very, very poor inter-arms cooperation. Artillery fires according to fixed fire plans. Tanks motor off, leaving the infantry behind. Infantry doesn't press forward close enough behind the advancing barrage, etc. The problem is they identify this and then do it all again. And there's very little evolution until you start getting this relatively small core of experienced veterans who are surviving long enough. And all the way through this war, the Red Army's losses are absolutely colossal. But as with so many wars, the losses are borne predominantly by the most inexperienced troops. So by the time you get to 1944, that little body of real experienced veterans have a pretty good chance of surviving to the end of the war. They know how it's done and how to get the job done. But nonetheless, the Red Army does remain a blunt instrument. Engineering support, logistics support, these just continue to get better and better and better, but nowhere near what we would have regarded as normal in the West. Even by 1944, summer of 44, when the Red Army retakes Crimea, one of the generals talks about this great innovation he had of during an attack, he personally grabbed hold of a radio to speak to the fighter bomber pilots who were overhead to direct their attack. They had no forward air observers that would have been absolutely normal in Western forces and the Germans had from the outset of the war. They still used air power, or as you know, it was drawn up in the battle plan. At this time, the bombers will bomb this bit and then they'll bomb that bit. There was no flexibility, no ability to call in an airstrike to facilitate your movements. So this does remain a blunt cudgel. Bagration, which we talked about, so this unfolds at exactly the same time as Normandy. And so some interesting numbers for you. In the West, in the Battle of Normandy, for every British, American, Canadian soldier who gets killed or wounded, the Germans lose 2.2 men. The consequence of this is a catastrophic defeat for the Wehrmacht. At the same time, during Bagration, for every German soldier killed or wounded, the Red Army loses 2.2 men. And the Germans still go down to a catastrophic defeat. So this is the Soviet way of war. It's just, in the end, we've got more tanks, we've got more men, and we will just grind you down.
Next question will be in the front, but to your right.
Thank you. I thought it was a terrific discussion. My question is, to what degree would you ascribe the Soviet success to the amount of Lend-Lease aid they were receiving? I believe it was said earlier that Britain was receiving more aid than the Soviet Union, but I don't think the statistics show that.
I think probably by the time you add in the huge amounts of food that kept Britain fed during the war, in terms of sheer tonnage, you may well find that the United Kingdom benefited more than the Soviet Union. I'm not sure. But we absolutely must not underestimate the value of Western supplies. From Bagration until the Battle of Berlin, most of those major rivers running across northern Europe, the Vistula in particular, but some of the other rivers, there were no intact railway bridges. And this is an era where the Red Army was very dependent upon railways to move its supplies. So all of those supplies, so to go back to the analogy from the start, your start line running from New York down to Richmond, when you're preparing to attack Minneapolis in Minnesota, all the supplies for those armies have to be brought across that distance by truck. And nearly all of those trucks have been built in the United States. Many of them are fueled with gasoline provided by the United States. Without that, they wouldn't have got to Berlin. They would still have got to Berlin, but it would have taken a heck of a lot longer than it did. Within the Soviet Union, there was this great mythology around this. Many Soviet veterans believed that Sherman tanks that were being provided by the United States were actually being built in some obscure part of Siberia. Because it was, this was again part of the Soviet mythology. One thing, as a slight digression, I would encourage people to avoid this very easy and slightly lazy English language approach. Try not to use Russian and Soviet as synonymous. They're not. If you describe in the Second World War this as the Russians, you were ignoring the huge numbers of Ukrainians, Belarusians, Caucasians, etc., fighting in the Red Army. And also, we find even now, modern Russia uses this Western confusion over what is or was Russia to justify its claims to territories to which it has no right. So it's not just me being pedantic. Try to keep that separation in your heads.
Next question will be right at the center.
There was, of course, a celebrated coup that was unsuccessful. What would have been the event if it had been successful?
The July plot and the
Yes,
attempt to blow up
yes.
Hitler. Yeah. Does anybody want to skip dinner? And I can talk about this for hours. This is just a wonderful rabbit hole. During the Bagration book, I intended to write like a page on this. It turned into 3 chapters, which I then edited brutally down to 1 chapter. The thing here is, it's a really interesting question. I don't think the coup would ever have succeeded, even if they had killed the Führer. There would have been a civil war within Germany. There were too many who would not have accepted that. There is very good evidence that actually Himmler knew an attempt was coming and made no attempt to stop it. Now think about this. He's got his own private army. He's got the SS. He's head of all of the security services of the Reich. He sees himself as, well, if it's unfortunate and the Führer dies, oh, well, what a shame. But hey, how fortunate that I have the means to take power. So you'd have ended up with somebody else. The consequences could have been that during that period of civil war, remember, this is Germany holding off the Allies with one hand, the Soviets with the other. Any distraction from that might have been enough to destabilize one or other front line to precipitate a very rapid collapse. On the other hand, if that didn't happen, even if Hitler is dead and you have another regime that continues the war, and it's worth bearing in mind that Stauffenberg and the other plotters, these were not Democrats. Their intention was to negotiate a ceasefire with the West whilst continuing the war in the East, which was not going to be acceptable to Roosevelt. Churchill maybe would have been persuaded about that. I think Anthony may be able to make a comment on that. But certainly the United States would never have accepted that at that time. So you then end up with, all of the talk we had about the squandering of German resources in the Battle of the Bulge. That's down to Hitler. If you don't have Hitler and you have someone else in charge, you might get more rational German decision-making in the last months of the war, and actually killing Hitler might end up prolonging the war in a slightly perverse way. It's just one of those absolutely impossible what-ifs. You can cut this so many different ways.
What's also interesting is to look at the reaction of Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Stalin was like, well, let them kill the old dog, and Roosevelt was sort of indifferent. Churchill was quite angry because he was like, well, we want to fight this war to the end because we don't want another stab in the back theory.
Yeah,
So,
and exactly that. So, this great stab in the back legend that was used to justify the rearmament of Germany and the repudiation of the Treaty of Versailles. We didn't lose the First World War. The army was fighting bravely. It was the politicians who betrayed us. Complete rubbish. The German army was physically beaten. But can you imagine there would have been this on steroids if they had succeeded in killing Hitler and then had somehow negotiated some messy peace? There would have been absolute, fertile ground for a new movement to arise in Germany about this great betrayal.
And then you see the SOPAD reports, the Secret Service reports, when the secret police went around and they monitored the feelings of the Germans, and there was a huge burst of support for Hitler after the plot. Thank God our Führer was still alive.
And this was then almost, it was very rapidly weaponized by Goebbels, but even before he started, there was this prevailing feeling in many German circles: the hand of Providence saved the Führer. He is clearly destined to lead Germany to an even greater place in the world. This sort of mystical belief in the Führer was reinforced by this attempt to kill him.
We have time for at least one last question, all the way in the back to the right, please.
Hi. I've always been kind of curious. Why did Stalin trust Hitler? I mean, it's not like Hitler kept it a secret that he hated the communists, right? So was it a delaying tactic, or was it because he didn't know about Poland? So why would he actually trust him?
So this is at the beginning of the war when they had the non-aggression pact, etc. Alex may well want to jump in on this. My own feeling is that to a very large extent, he absolutely didn't trust him. I don't think Stalin trusted anybody, let's be honest. Even his closest cronies, there was a limit. This is the man who stood beaming at a Communist Party Congress while everyone stood and applauded him, and nobody dared stop clapping because whoever stopped clapping first was going to get shot. And seriously, they clapped until their hands bled. This was a level of suspicion within Stalin's inner world. He told his inner circle, Hitler thinks he's pulled one over on me, but actually I'm the one who's outsmarted him. The point was the Red Army was, it had entered Poland shortly after the German invasion, and then that first winter in 39-40, it got drawn into the Winter War in Finland and performed appallingly. He knew the Red Army was in terrible shape. He needed to get the purges out of the system, needed the more modern equipment to arrive, and he saw this as a means of buying time. He then starts to suffer from what many politicians, and indeed all of us do from time to time, which is huge confirmation bias. So because I need more time to rearm and reorganize, when you start getting intelligence saying, actually, Hitler's going to attack, no, I can't believe that, because that's not convenient. It doesn't fit with my plan, so it must be wrong.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, trust is not the word I'd use between them, but certainly Stalin was highly manipulative and totally paranoid. But he did use Hitler in that sense, that he wanted the Western allies he thought that the French were going to attack Germany. There'd be a nice war over in the West, and then he could sort of sit pretty, and it was all very convenient. There was also huge transfer of goods and material and technology transfers and so on between the two of them. And there does seem to have been some sort of some sort of respect between dictators somehow, that there was a kind of, they sort of thought they'd summed one another up and could live with this. As you say, not trust, but some other kind of respect
Yes.
between each other. And Stalin really genuinely was surprised about the timing of Barbarossa, it seems.
Yeah, I think he knew that a war was coming, and he was preparing. And there are, according to depending on who you believe, the Red Army was preparing its own offensive. May or may not be true. Certainly, they were making contingencies for such an offensive, but that needed more time. So if you need more time, then that means you can't start a war sooner. So all of this evidence that we're going to start a war sooner, it has to be wrong. Otherwise, I've miscalculated, and I'm Stalin, and I don't do miscalculation. You know.
Yeah, true enough.
Ladies and gentlemen, Alexandra Richie and Prit Buttar, thank you.
Thank you very much.